Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This week's activities and readings are all focused on challenging behaviors in individuals with autism. So, before we begin, I just want to clarify and stress that challenging behaviors are not a diagnostic characteristic of autism. Okay. That being said, it is a common characteristic. Right. So if we think about what are the diagnostic and defining features of autism, so those would be our social communication difficulties, restricted interest, repetitive behaviors. You can imagine that anyone who has those difficulties are prone or likely to engage in challenging behaviors. So imagine if you are an individual who cannot get their basic needs met because you have difficulties communicating what you need, right? Oftentimes that can result in frustration, which then leads to challenging behaviors. Right? If you're an individual who really likes sense and order, right, and someone comes along and messes it up for you, messes up your environment, and you're not fully understanding why that's happening, you could see how that would result in frustration, which can then present itself as challenging behavior. So, just to reiterate, challenging behaviors are not a diagnostic feature of autism, though it is a common occurrence. All right. So, I wanted to change things up a little bit this week. Instead of doing our traditional mini lecture, I thought it would be helpful to you all and perhaps more beneficial if you were to see an applied example of how I, as a teacher, dealt with a challenging behavior. So instead of your traditional mini lecture, I'm going to present a case study of an actual student that I worked with. So, for the purpose of this mini lecture, I'm going to change his name to protect his identity. So, I'm going to call him Jake. So, Jake is a student that I first worked with when I was a preschool teacher. So, when I first met Jake, he was 3 years old. And in preschool, in Washington State, preschool goes from 3 to age 5. So, I actually worked with him as a teacher when he was much younger. But with many individuals with autism, and as the case is with Jake, his family insurance covered additional home based applied behavior analytic therapy. So he received additional services outside of school in his home. And those home based services were grounded in applied behavior analysis. And at the time when I was working with Jake, um, I was actually a doctoral student, and so I was no longer teaching in a classroom, but his family had asked if I'd be willing to continue working with him in his home programming. So I helped develop his home programming, and I supervised folks who were working with him, and I worked with him directly as it addressed to address this challenging behavior, which had been going on for quite a while. So when we were working on this challenging behavior, he was 8 years old. He does have a diagnosis of autism, qualifies for special education in social, communication, and cognitive domains. At the time, he was currently receiving his educational services in a center based program or self contained program for students ranging from kindergarten to age 2. All of these students had IEPs and had identified disabilities. Um, and his family is highly involved in his education and caregiving. And I mention that here because I developed this behavior plan to be implemented in his home, right? Because I was not his classroom teacher anymore at this time. I was only working with him in the home setting. And so when you're developing a plan, you want to consider who would be implementing and supporting the plan. So in Jake's case, it was his family. And his family consisted not only of just his nuclear family, right, which consisted of an older brother, his two parents, but he also had two sets of grandparents who were highly involved in his caretaking. So when we were developing this plan, we had to consider everyone who might be involved in addressing this behavior and implementing the plan. So a lot of people that we needed to consider given the context of this situation. So I'm going to show you a video of the behavior so you get a sense of it from just this still. So Jake's family was concerned because he was increasingly frequently biting his hands to a point where he would actually break skin, and he had some pretty severe callus and scarring. So I'm going to show you a video of what it looks like without intervention. All right. So you got a sense there of what the behavior looked like, what the topography of the behavior is. All right. So I should mention that in this video, he is 8 years old. I was working with him at home, overseeing his home programming. But I mentioned that I worked with him when he was 3. Right. At the time, we did not notice this behavior, or it wasn't a behavior that required intervention because it wasn't impacting his learning. It wasn't really impacting his ability to socialize with other kids, right? But I was looking through some of my photos and I came across this photo. And this is Jake when he was my student. So in this picture, he is 3. And what I noticed is if you look closely at his hand there, right? It looks like he was biting his hand. You could see it's kind of wet, and I assume that's from saliva. You see some redness, which I assume is from his teeth, right? So, this, in hindsight, led us to become more aware that this behavior had been going on for a long time. So, in preschool, it wasn't considered an interfering behavior because it's developmentally appropriate, first of all, for young children to put things in their mouth, right? And yes, he is 3, but again, he does have autism, and he does have a pretty significant cognitive delay. So developmentally, it wasn't abnormal to see him put something in his mouth. And again, it wasn't to the point where he was really doing a lot of damage. You do see some redness, right? But this was not a behavior that concerned any of his teachers or his parents at the time. But from a behavioral perspective, this signals to me that this behavior has been going on for, at this point, at least 5 years, because he was 3 in this picture, right? When I was working with him in his home programming, he was 8. So for at least 5 years, probably longer, this behavior was occurring. But it didn't reach the severity to require intervention until fairly recently, right? But when we see a behavior that starts when you're young and continues over a period of time, we have to think of what might be maintaining this behavior. And especially when we see a behavior that's been occurring for a long time, that signals to me that this is a behavior that has a strong history of reinforcement. Right? He's been engaging in this behavior for over 5 years. The context or consequences that might be maintaining this behavior have been in place for over 5 years. Okay? So that is important from an instructional perspective because we know that behaviors that have been reinforced for a long period of time are going to be harder to change. Not that they're impossible, but they are harder to change. Right? You've probably heard of the old saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? Well, that's not necessarily true. It's just harder, right? Because they're really set in their ways. Or from a behavioral perspective, they've been reinforced for engaging in behaviors over time, right? And it's worked for them in the past. They're going to continue working to do it. Okay. All right. So this was a picture when he was 8. So this is when it dried up. This actually looks pretty good. There were times where all of those wounds were open, but this is all really, if you actually saw it in person, it was really calloused, really thick, right? And it was it was always his left hand that he would do it on, but he started first kind of by his thumb, and then that would get sore, so he would move to his wrist or other knuckles. Okay. So it got to a point where he was kind of running out of skin. It was breaking skin, and his parents were getting really concerned because, again, he was 8 years old and doing this, right? So it looked developmentally inappropriate at this point. Okay. So his previous teachers in elementary school had tried some strategies to address this behavior. So they tried to teach him what they called safe hands, which is essentially keeping his hands out of his mouth, right? And they would reinforce any occurrence of him engaging in safe hand behavior, right? So they would reinforce him with social praise, with edibles. He had a token system at one point. So they used all sorts of reinforcement systems to try to encourage and increase the use of safe hands, which is a physically incompatible behavior to engaging in hand biting, right? So in other words, if he's engaging in safe hands, which means hands out of his mouth, that means he cannot physically be engaging in the challenging behavior. You can't have your hands in your mouth as well as out of your mouth, right? They also tried some social stories. So that they would read social stories to him at the start of class every day, in which they addressed the topic of, keeping your hands safe, right? They also tried to replace the hand biting behavior with other biting behaviors that are more appropriate. So giving him chewing gum. So hoping that if his mouth was occupied chewing, he wouldn't stick his hand in his mouth, right? He also had a chewy tube, which is like a silicone tube that he would chew on in class. So they tried other strategies that were not successful in really decreasing or eliminating the behavior. So the parents reached out to me, and we conducted our own functional behavior assessment. So in a functional behavior assessment, we're looking for patterns in the environment. So we're looking at antecedents or common features that might occur before the behavior that might be setting the occasion or triggering the behavior. We're also looking at consequences. So what happens after the behavior? Because that would give us an indication of what might be maintaining the behavior. It also would allow us to start making predictions or hypotheses as to what the function of that behavior is. Right? So to recall, when we talk about challenging behaviors, we oftentimes talk about it as serving some function for that individual. And that function usually falls into one of two categories. First being to obtain something, right? So to obtain attention, to obtain tangibles, right? Or to escape something. So to escape attention, to escape task demands, okay? And the way you determine the function of the behavior is to collect data. You observe that individual throughout the day and during times in which he is likely to engage in the behavior. Right, so I took different types of data. I collected ABC data, antecedent behavior consequence data, in which I just merely observed and wrote anecdotal notes as to what happened before the behavior and what happened after. Right, so I would just watch him in his natural setting around his parents. I also conducted a structured interview with key family members to try to gain additional information that might inform my hypothesis regarding the function of the behavior. So the patterns that we saw from the data was that there were a number of antecedents or a number of things that would occur that would set the occasion for this hand biting behavior. The most common one was being hugged, especially being hugged by his grandparents. Right? So oftentimes he would receive a hug, he would engage in hand biting, right? He would also do it while he was watching a video alone. So oftentimes this was a preferred video because he's choosing it, right? It's during his break time. And we would observe and notice that as he's just laying on the couch watching the video, he would bite his hand, right? Another common antecedent was when he was told he couldn't have something, right? So when I would come, he was oftentimes on his computer and I would give him his, 2-minute warning. And then when I denied him access to his computer, he might bite his hand, right? Or it'd be dinner time. He wanted chicken nuggets. His mom was serving something else and said, "We're not having chicken nuggets." he wouldn't engage in the hand biting. All right, so we have different antecedents here. Okay. There were also different consequences that occurred following the behavior. The most common consequence was the adult telling him, put your hands down, right? And then he would continue to engage in the behavior that he was engaging in. So if he was hugging his grandparents would say, oh, hands down, Jake, hands down. But he would still continue to receive his hug, right? Other times it was ignored. So if he was watching a video alone, oftentimes it would go ignored because there might not be another adult in the room, right? Or if it wasn't severe enough, an adult wouldn't redirect him, right? There were times too where if he was denied access to a preferred item and he would bite his hand, he would gain access to that item, right? This happened a lot with his grandparents in particular, that grandma would tell him, nope, you can't have the fruit roll up. He would bite his hands, and then grandma would give in and say, oh, okay, stay calm, here you go, right? Another common consequence was the adult simply restate the direction or expectation, right? So if he was denied access to something, the adult would just say, nope, it's not time for that. Okay, so we see here that there are a lot of antecedents that are setting the occasion for the behavior, and there are several consequences that might be maintaining it or reinforcing the behavior. All right, so part of our job when we're doing these functional behavior assessments is to take all the information we've gathered, right, through our direct observation, through our interviews, and try to figure out how that data converges. What patterns are emerging? Okay. So I summarize here the different assessments I did. One of them was a motivation assessment scale, which is a rating scale, direct observation through the ABC data, as well as information that I gathered through the functional assessment interview with his caregivers. Right. Based on that data, the function that always emerged would be to obtain something, right? So the most common function was to obtain sensory input. So when you bite your hand, you receive tactile stimulation on your hand, right? There's also pressure on your teeth, right? So that's also a tactile stimulation, right? So that was always the most common perceived function that emerged from my data. But there were also times where he was being reinforced by actually gaining access to a tangible, right, or a preferred activity. Right? So there were times where it might be automatically reinforced, and that's what we call sensory based function, or socially mediated, meaning an adult or a person gave Jake access to something, right? So it wasn't clear cut, but it allowed us to create a hierarchy of what hypothesis we were going to build our plan on first. Okay, and again, when you're doing a functional behavior assessment, it's based on hypothesis, and you're using the best data you have, but it could be that you get the hypothesis wrong, right? So we built our initial plan on the hypothesis that this behavior was being primarily maintained by obtaining sensory input. All right. So here are my summary statements. So again, there are two possible functions, right? So when he's receiving physical affection, such as hugs or tickles, Jake will bite his hand in order to gain additional sensory input, right? When you're getting physical affection, especially in the forms of hugs or tickles, right? There's lots of tactile stimulation. You're getting hug, right? You're getting nice tactile input from tickles, right? He would bite his hand in order to gain additional sensory input that I'm assuming that that's something he liked, right? An alternative is when Jake is denied access to a desired item or activity, he will bite his hand in order to obtain the desired item or activity, right? So again, we have two summary statements that we were able to derive from our data. Okay, I want to summarize here some of my data from when I observed him during the home therapy sessions. So when we did our home programming, we still had a routine of activities that we did and a schedule of activities. So I noted down and took data as to when the hand biting would occur, right? So the y-axis here is the number of hand bites, right? The x-axis is the activity that we were engaging in. And I just reported the raw data here, or the raw frequency data, because each time I observed it, it was always for an hour and a half. Our sessions were always an hour and a half together. Right. So based on this data, you can see that hand biting most frequently occurred during our obstacle course activity. So this would be a little activity where I would set up a bunch of different activities, and it was a way to embed opportunities for him to learn how to follow 1- and 2-step directions. So we would do that in kind of a physical obstacle course. Right? He would also engage in it during break, right? And breaks throughout the session. So I gave him breaks periodically throughout the hour and a half session. But you can see here that oftentimes the hand biting occurred when he was being physically active, right? Or when he was just kind of chilling out by himself, right? When no adults were really putting any demands on him, right? So this further supports this idea that perhaps this is serving a sensory function. If students are engaging in the target behavior when no adults are around, that should signal to us that perhaps this is being maintained or reinforced by some kind of self-stimulation or sensory stimulation. All right, so when I'm thinking about developing a plan, you have to graph out what is the model for when the behavior occurs. So that is what's happening in this light grayish blue box, right? So this is our antecedent right here, right? When Jake is receiving physical affection in the form of hugs, he will engage in this behavior, right? Which is hand biting. The consequence of engaging in hand biting is he's receiving sensory input, okay? So this is currently what's happening in terms of our 3-term contingency, right? Again, antecedent is hugs, behavior is hand biting, consequence is sensory input. Now, when you are developing a behavior plan, you need to think of what is another behavior that the student can engage in that will give him the same consequence that is more appropriate, okay? So that is this yellow box here. So when Jake gets a hug, what is another activity he can engage in that will give him the same outcome, right? Because clearly he's engaging in this behavior because he gets something out of it and it's something that he wants, right? So we need to give him a replacement behavior that's more socially appropriate and acceptable, but yet will still give him the same consequence that he's seeking, right? So when I talked with his family, we figured that the sensory input that was primarily maintaining this behavior was the sensory input he was getting by biting his hand, right? So the sensation he gets by hand pressure. So we decided to go with that as opposed to oral tactile stimulation, because if you remember, what was tried before was teachers did try to give him gum and a chewy tube. So they did try to replace the oral behavior with a replacement behavior, and that was not successful. So now we decided, well, maybe it's not his mouth. Maybe it's more his hands that he's seeking sensory input on. So that is why we chose a replacement behavior where we're teaching him how to squeeze his hands really tight, okay? Either squeezing his hands himself or asking an adult to squeeze, because his hands are little, right? So if he needs more pressure, he can always ask an adult who has a stronger grip, okay? So what we're going to teach him in this behavior plan was when he's receiving physical affection, he would squeeze hands, and the end result would be he would get the same consequence. Oops. Oh dear. Sorry about that, friends. All right, so that is where we start. Now, we recognize that that is a great place to start because it would decrease the hand biting behavior, but the reality is eventually he just needs to learn how not to bite his hands, right? Or squeeze his hands, right? An adult can't always be around him squeezing his hands for him, right? So while we were teaching the replacement behavior, we were also simultaneously teaching the desired behavior. The desired behavior is really just to keep your hands safe. So this was a term that we used because it was a familiar term for him. His teachers use the same term, safe hands. All right. Now, if he engaged in the desired behavior, you have to think about what is the consequence or what is the reinforcement he's going to get. All right. So the reinforcement is that he continues to receive physical attention. Right. So assuming he is he receives a hug, if he keeps his hands safe, we're going to continue to give him hugs. Okay? Right, so we have a lot of plans in place here. Right? The idea is we're going to try to decrease or eliminate the inappropriate behavior by replacing the inappropriate behavior with an appropriate replacement behavior that gets the same function, while also teaching a new behavior. So reinforcing that new behavior of keeping his hands safe. Okay. All right. So, in order to truly address a challenging behavior, especially a behavior that's been as persistent and pervasive as this for this student, we need to build a comprehensive plan that includes antecedent strategies. So, strategies that we're going to try to implement to prevent that behavior from happening in the first place. Right? We need to outline specific teaching strategies because, again, these are new skills we're teaching Jake, right? Squeezing his hand is a new skill. Keeping his hand safe is a relatively new skill because it's not something that is truly part or solidly part of his behavioral repertoire because he's not consistently doing it. Okay, so we have our antecedent strategies, we have teaching strategies, and then we have consequence strategies. So what are we going to do when he engages in different behaviors? So our antecedent strategies were to first of all use other forms of affection. So our plan is built on this idea that hugs are the main trigger for him. Okay, so our initial strategy would be, maybe there are other things we can do to show affection to him, especially as he's just learning these coping skills. So high fives, right? Smiling, right? Pats on the back, right? But the reality is, you really can't tell grandparents or parents not to hug their child, right? That's just not appropriate or really ethical. So our compromise was, well, you know what? I noticed that Jake tends to engage in hand biting when he's doing like these big bear hugs. All right. So let's first start off by just reducing how long we hug. So we said that we're going to try to limit our hugs to 3 seconds or less while he's learning these behaviors. Okay. So hopefully by using this antecedent strategies, we're preventing hand biting from happening in the first place, right? But remember, in addition to preventing the challenging behavior, we still need to teach those replacement behaviors and the desired behavior. So in order to teach our students, we always want to think about how many opportunities does he have to practice this skill, okay? And what does he need to be successful? So we identified that we're going to naturally teach the skill at the start of our session because that's usually when grandparents want to hug him because we go and work upstairs, they stay downstairs, and they say, Jake, come give me a hug, right? So we're going to always practice at the beginning, right? And then especially initially, we included times where I went down during our break and, he would have an opportunity to hug his grandparents, right? Now, in order to teach him how to squeeze his hands, again, it's a new skill, right? It's a skill that he doesn't know how to do. So I have to be ready to prompt him to engage in the behavior. All right. So this actually takes 2 people. So I would allow him to go in for a hug, and I would be right there behind grandma or grandpa. And when I saw Jake go towards his mouth, right, I would physically prompt him to squeeze, right? Or I would verbally prompt him to say, squeeze my hand, right? Because remember, he can either squeeze his own hand or request for me to squeeze it, right? Now, the consequences are, if he engages in the inappropriate behavior, which is he somehow gets his hand to his mouth and he bites, the grandparents or whoever's hugging him immediately withdraws the hug, right? Okay. If he engages in the replacement behavior, which is squeezing his own hand or asking an adult to squeeze, we would give him praise, behavior-specific praise. Like, oh, you're right, nice job asking for a squeeze. Sure, I'll squeeze your hand. Okay. If he keeps his hand down, the natural consequence is he gets to continue to be hugged, right? So here you see we have to outline antecedent strategies, teaching strategies, and a number of consequence strategies depending on the different behaviors the student might engage in. All right, here's our data. So the blue data here is my baseline. Again, on the y-axis is hand biting, which is the frequency, right? And the observation. So these are all 1.5 hour sessions. So this was 15 days I worked with him. The first 6 days, I did not have the intervention plan in place. This was just merely baseline. You can see that throughout our observations, we see a steady increase, right? Still variable, but it is increasing, right? So on average, I would say around Jake would bite his hand about 4 times in an 1.5 hour session. Once the behavior plan was implemented, we see an immediate decrease in the behavior, and we see the trend of the behavior continuing to decrease, right? So at this point, we are seeing that our plan is taking some effect. It's not completely eliminating the behavior, but we're getting there. So I want to show you a clip of what Jake does during the intervention. So this is when we've taught him how to either request squeeze or squeeze his hands himself, okay? All right. So you could see there that Jake, through our antecedent-based strategies, so me limiting my hugs to 3 seconds, right? Um, it seems as if he had learned this new replacement behavior of squeezing his hands, right? And he's also keeping his hands safe, which allows me to continue to hug him, right? Um, so our plan is showing initial effects, right? We are seeing a decrease in our challenging behavior. Now, for the first part, it was primarily me who was implementing the plan, but now that we see that that we believe it might be effective, my next step is to make sure that the adults in his environment are able to implement the plan when I'm not there. Okay, so to help support this implementation, I developed a really clear checklist of what needs to happen in terms of antecedent strategies, how we're going to teach, and then how we're going to reinforce the appropriate behaviors. All right, so I'm going to show you the behavior checklist, and then I'm going to spend the last part talking about contextual fit. All right, so here's an example of his behavior checklist. So I outlined preventative strategies. So using physical affection other than hugging, right? Limiting the duration of the hugs, okay? Teaching strategies. When he was being hugged, did you prompt him to squeeze his own hands, right? Or did you prompt him to request for a hand squeeze, right? I also outlined all of the specific reinforcement strategies that we had discussed, okay? And then the important one here is, do you know what to do if he engages in hand biting? Right? I want to make sure that if he engages in hand biting, we immediately release him from the hug. He no longer receives positive reinforcement for that. Right. So what we would do is periodically each adult would check in with me and fill this form out. Okay. So part of the success of a behavior plan is, first of all, implementing it with fidelity. So that's what that behavior checklist would allow us to do, is to make sure that it's being implemented as designed. But even the most technologically sound behavior plan is not going to be effective if it's not compatible with the environment or the people who have to implement it. So that is why it's so important to evaluate the contextual fit of your plan. okay? Because the plan needs to be implemented by people in a real natural context. And if there's misalignment in any of those areas, your plan will not be effective. When we're thinking about contextual fit, we need to think more than techniques. So techniques are important. So having the appropriate antecedent strategies, having the appropriate teaching strategies, having the appropriate consequence strategies. Those are all very important, but contextual fit is also just as important. Right? When you're evaluating contextual fit, you need to think about the person, right? So in this case, my person is Jake. Does the plan actually fit, and is it appropriate for the person for whom the plan is designed? Okay. So that is why with Jake, we gave him the option of learning to squeeze his hands or to request hand squeezes, right? Because we acknowledge that Jake's hands are small and maybe that's not going to give him sufficient pressure, right? We also acknowledge that Jake has verbal ability, so he can easily request for a hand squeeze. Now, if Jake did not have spontaneous language, we would need to modify that, right? How would Jake be able to communicate that's what he wants easily and efficiently? Okay. So this plan and the strategies we chose, we considered Jake's strengths and his needs. We also need to think about the overall team. So if you're in a classroom, the team consists of you as the teacher, as well as any of your teaching staff, related service personnel. Right? So does this make sense in terms of the people who will implement the plan? Right? So that is why one of our antecedent strategies was initially it was just that we would use alternative forms of affection, right? That was not a good fit for this family team, right? Families acknowledge like I cannot not give my child a hug, right? So we had to adjust the plan to still allow them to hug their child, right? But do it in a way that hopefully wasn't going to trigger the behavior, right? And we also need to consider the overall system, which includes the overall environment in which the plan will be implemented. So that would be the classroom that is nested within a school, right? In this case, it was the home, right? And the home environment and the home routine, right? So we need to think about all three of those things, okay? All right. So more about the person. So we want to make sure that the person, that when we're thinking about the contextual fit as it aligns with the person, is that our behavior plan builds on and incorporates the existing strengths and capabilities. All right. So again, I mentioned that Jake had verbal ability and he knew how to request pretty easily and advocate for his needs. Okay. We want to make sure it incorporates the person's preferences. Right? So we know that Jake likes physical affection, right? So the most natural consequence that we can incorporate to reinforce the behavior is giving him physical affection, right? We want to make sure that our plan addresses, to the greatest extent possible, all areas of need and result in increased quality of life, right? So we want to make sure that if we are able to effectively decrease this behavior, that this would allow him to better integrate or be better included in his community and his school environment. Because remember, the reason why we started to intervene on this behavior is because the hand biting was stigmatizing. His parents were concerned that people around him didn't want to play with him because it looked so odd when he bit his hands. They thought that he was being aggressive, right? When he was biting his hands, he wasn't able to really participate in school or any learning opportunities. So by decreasing this or eliminating it, it's going to allow Jake to be more fully and actively involved in his community and his school. Right. The second area we need to consider is the overall team, right? We want to make sure that anyone who's involved in implementing the plan is comfortable with the goals that are driving this plan. Right? So in this case, the goal was to decrease hand biting. So everyone was on the same page and agreed that this was a behavior that was worthy of developing such an intense plan around. Right? We wanted to make sure that any strategies that we use, so the antecedent strategies, consequence strategies, were things that all family members knew how to do and would be trained to do, and they would have the resources to do it. And we also wanted to make sure that we had appropriate buy-in, right? That we reviewed all the elements of the plan and we want to make sure that everyone not only understood the plan but actually believed it might work, right? So we were making sure that we got input from everyone throughout the entire process. Right. Finally, the system. So again, the system is the broader context in which the plan is implemented, right? So in this case, it was his home and his home routine, right? So the physical environment was his actual house, right? The people who were in his house were all involved, right? We considered routines in which the behavior would typically occur in, right? And the schedule of activities that naturally occur at home. So it was as natural and it fit as much as it possibly could. Okay. Right. So that completes our little case study with Jake. I hope that was helpful to see like a real applied example of a behavior plan that is aligned with a perceived function of a behavior. The remaining tasks you have to complete before our class meeting include reading chapter 3. This will be what you base your discussion role on. And there's also an article that I wrote with my colleague, Annie McLaughlin, that is on our Canvas site that I would like you to read. It's about addressing stereotypic and repetitive behaviors. Uh, and there's also going to be some Ask the Expert products that will be posted under the class meeting header. Please make sure you view that before class so that you are ready to ask the expert questions. All right, as always, you will need to submit your discussion role before class and complete the knowledge check. All right, folks, that's all for now. Thank you. Bye.